Welcome.
Thank you, Heather, and thank you everybody for joining us. It's a huge pleasure to be here. And after that build up from Heather, I'm really the pressure's on now.
Absolutely. The pressure's on, and we're seeing things
Yeah.
in the chat about what people are curious to know more about: the gut feeling, how to connect to the intuition, particularly in this world of data and AI. So I think it's such a timely opportunity to have this conversation.
It is actually it's intuition's time, isn't it? I think the time is now right. The zeitgeist for intuition has arrived. Ironically, now that we have artificial intelligence, intuition has come into its own. So yeah, absolutely.
So why did you write this particular book, and with this title, Trust Your Gut Now? Why did you write it? And tell us a bit about it, Eugene, in your own words.
It's a terrific question, Heather. So the idea behind the book, the main concept of the book is something that I've called intuitive intelligence. And I first wrote about intuitive intelligence almost 20 years ago, kind of in passing in a journal article. And I talked about intuitive intelligence as a really key capability for managers in the future going ahead. But really, I didn't really do anything with intuitive intelligence itself as a concept in those intervening years. It was always there in the back burner, in the fridge, so to speak, waiting to be taken out. So in those intervening 20 years, I did a lot of research on intuition. I wrote books about it, wrote lots of articles about it, published in journals, worked with managers, tried to teach it to my students as well. But intuitive intelligence was always there. So it was one of those things that would never go away. And then, we said earlier about artificial intelligence. So, every time we open a newspaper or social media or switch on the television or the radio, artificial intelligence, AI is the
AI.
thing. So that then immediately it's a little bit of a challenge almost to an intuition researcher to say, okay, well, if artificial intelligence is the thing, where does that leave human intuition in this big picture?
Great question.
As I'm kind of a unashamed fan and advocate for human intuition, with all its flaws but all its powers as well, its powers and its perils. I thought the time was about right for a little book which could explain the concept of intuitive intelligence to an audience of managers, leaders, senior leaders, anybody really who's got that kind of curiosity about this mystical, magical thing called intuition, which actually, when we look at it through the lens of science, isn't mystical or magical at all, in my view, although I respect the magical, the mystical view of it. But in my view, it's not mystical or magical. The science of intuition, which has progressed enormously in the past 20 years, the science of intuition reveals it not to be mystical or magical, but reveals it to be muscular. And so the idea of the book, it's a little bit like the idea behind Goleman's emotional intelligence, where,
Right.
his whole program of work was about people understanding what their emotions were about, what their emotions were trying to tell them, and then ultimately trying to manage their emotions, both in themselves and in others. So in the same way, the analog, I guess, is that intuitive intelligence is about noticing your intuitions, noticing your gut feelings, noticing your hunches, understanding why you've had them, interpreting them, trying to translate, tune in and translate what they're trying to tell you, and then using that knowledge, using that intelligent use intelligent use of intuition to take better decisions in your professional life. But the other thing about the intuition as well, and intuitive intelligence, I think, is that it's kind of generic, even though the skills that you learn about how to use your intuition intelligently in your professional life will apply to professional workplace decisions. It can also translate across to your personal life as well. So the generic skill of intuitive intelligence goes across the piece. So it was really to put forward this idea of intuitive intelligence, which I think the time is now right for it. Now that we're in the age of artificial intelligence. So that's something of the background. I hope that helps.
Yeah, no, that really helps. And I think it's super parallel that you draw with Daniel Goleman's emotional intelligence, when he articulated that as an idea, and that's really caught on. And people now think about not only their rational intelligence, which of course we put so much emphasis on in education, whether it be at school or even in business schools. There's a lot that focuses on the rational intelligence, but then that needs to be balanced by the more emotional intelligence, and you're saying, and the intuitive intelligence, because that's a very uniquely human skill that helps us to navigate in this increasing world of data deluge, data.
Yeah. I mean, the data deluge thing is something we're all aware of. But I really like your point there about the different intelligences, plural, because we think about intelligence singular, and we always think
Yeah.
about intelligence as being IQ and everything that goes with that. But going back way back now to the 90s and the 80s, we had this whole theory of multiple intelligences, and maybe the time is right now for a new take on multiple intelligences. And we talked about the book, and you've highlighted there the three intelligences that I kind of frame up in the book are rational stroke analytical intelligence, which is the kind of intelligence that business schools and colleges and universities and education in general has been really good at developing, undoubtedly. Yeah. It's a kind of intelligence that we assuredly need without any shadow of a doubt. So you've got that rational analytical intelligence. Then you mentioned the emotional intelligence as a second one. Linked, if we want to link that to the kind of physiology and biology of it, linked to the limbic system and so on and so forth, as Goleman did in his work. Albeit we know that Goleman's had criticisms, and we can leave those to one side for a moment. No one can deny that emotional intelligence hasn't been hugely influential and hugely important, and has impacted on practice. So we've got the rational analytical intelligence, the emotional intelligence, and now I think the time is right for this intuitive intelligence. And if you like, it's this idea of this suite of three multiple intelligences which human beings need to be successful, both in their workplace lives and in their personal lives as well. But in times that we live in kind of have switched the spotlight almost a little bit away from the rational analytical intelligence, in a sense that machines are very highly capable of the rational analytical intelligence. And that's another debate again about where that leaves human analytical intelligence with the rise of the machine. Yeah. But then that almost switches the spotlight across then to those uniquely human things like emotion. But let's not make it all about emotional intelligence. Let's switch the spotlight across to the one it's almost like this close relative emotional intelligence, intuitive intelligence, and say, what is that all about? Where does it come from? How does intuition work? When does it work? When does it not work? What are our gut feelings trying to tell us? And when should we use them? And when should we not use them? Which is equally important. And kind of leveraging that knowledge to take better decisions. But then again, to place it in this bigger picture of the whole artificial intelligence thing and about the workplace of the future, I think we have to ask ourselves as human beings, it's quite a big, profound question, almost like an existential question in a way. What value are we going to add in the workplace of the future? Now that we've got generative artificial intelligence, what happens when we get general artificial intelligence, if and when that happens? Big debates about when that will happen. But where does that leave the human? And of course, I would argue, and I think there are strong grounds to do so, I would argue that intuition is one of those areas in which human beings have added unique value to the workplace and will continue to add unique value with all its downsides as well as its upsides. And I think this is an important point about it. One of the strange things about intuition is that this idea that it's powerful and perilous. It can be your decision-making friend and your decision-making foe, and it can help and hinder your intuition. And I think the key to intuitive intelligence and the key to intelligent use of intuition is understanding its strengths and its weaknesses.
I think that's really helpful, that we're going to have a balanced conversation. This is not the fan club of intuition. So I see a number of comments in the chat. Hello, Alexis. I see your comments in the chat. You're advising people to get away from using their gut instinct in a family business to deal with strategy, etc. So why would we propose the opposite? And I like that you talk about the balance between knowing when it's useful and knowing when it's not useful. And I think what we want to talk about is when indeed can people make the most use of their intuition, and what are some of the traps to be aware of in terms of bias, of course, and when is it less helpful to use intuition? But perhaps you can kick us off by just telling us in your words what is intuition for you. There's a number of ideas in the chat about what it is, but what do you say it is, Eugene?
All right. So the simplest definition of intuition, it's not a scientific definition, but simple. And simple is often, the most useful. For me, it's knowing without knowing how or why you know. You just know. And I've interviewed lots of people over the years in my research. I'm mainly a qualitative researcher now. I was a quantitative researcher for years using questionnaires and other things to look at cognitive styles. And then I kind of had this Damascene moment and conversion to qualitative methods. And I've done in-depth interviews with hundreds of people over the years, trying to get them to tell me about this subjective experience of intuition, what it is. And often it boils down to this idea that knowing without knowing how or why you know. And if you push people in a conversation, in an interview, you really kind of push them as hard as you can to try to get them to tell you what it is. It ultimately arrives. They come back to three words, and they say, "I just know," which is, it's not really helpful scientifically, but it's said in the interviews. It's said with such conviction. I
Yes.
just know. I just know that this situation is not right for me. I just know that that opportunity is right for me. I just know that this person is spinning me a yarn.
Hmm.
Or I just know that I can trust this person. Now, the whole thing about bias and everything else comes with that as a caveat, and we can get to that a little bit later. But for me, that idea of knowing without knowing how or why you know is the most useful definition. I can give a long-winded scientific definition of it, which is even better than the kind of the lay definition. So intuitions are effectively charged judgments. In other words, they involve gut feeling. They're affectively charged judgments that arise through rapid, non-conscious and holistic associations. That's the textbook definition of intuition, which basically says they involve gut feelings. At the end of the day, they're just a judgment in the way that rationality doesn't give any guarantee of success. Rationality is not 100% successful. Neither is intuition, in spite of what some advocates for intuition would like us to believe. It's rapid, it's non-conscious. We don't know where it comes from. It's this strange thing that comes from behind the screen of our conscious awareness and arrives in our mind and it can't speak in words. So my
Right, in
analytical
words.
I don't know what it's like for you, and I can't get inside your head to work out, to find out what it's like being you. But if you get inside my head to find out what it's like being me, then my analytical mind is constantly chattering away. I've got this
Uh-huh.
internal
Same.
verbalization, there, and that's the analytical mind talking away, talking away, talking away. And the poor old intuitive mind sitting alongside it can't get a word, literally can't get a word in edgeways. So it
Right.
has to have a way to tell us what it thinks. And this is
Mm.
this whole point about affective charge. So it's the way that it tells us what it thinks is through a feeling.
Hmm.
So that's kind of the non-conscious aspect of it and the way that it tells us what it thinks. And then the final bit of that long-winded but classic textbook definition of intuition is that it's based on holistic associations. And that's really important in understanding the science behind intuition, because intuition is basically it's something that is learnable. That's an important point. It's a developable skill. I said at the outset that I don't think it's magical or mystical, it's muscular. And like any muscle, it can be developed through learning, practice, experience, feedback, coaching, etc. And this ability to recognize patterns is built up over many years. We've got this whole thing about 10,000 hours, the 10-year
Yep.
rule, which it's controversial, but I think there's a lot of
Yep.
truth in it. And this idea to recognize patterns in the definition, holistic associations, is the key to intuition. I think it's this ability that our intuitive mind, which is it's a broad bandwidth processor. So if you think of it, in terms of fiber optics, then the cable for your intuitive mind is broad bandwidth. The cable for your analytical mind is narrow bandwidth. It can only deal with the analytical mind can only deal with so much information at one time. The intuitive mind, on the other hand, this broad bandwidth, this is an analogy, of course, it's a broad bandwidth processor. Therefore, it can deal with a huge amount of information coming at it, multiple cues. I call it a constellation of cues can be coming at the intuitive mind all at once. and somehow, magically, it can deal with them, make sense of them. What it's very good at is seeing patterns. It's a
Yes.
pattern recognition system. And a lot of the early research, the pioneering research on this was done with chess grandmasters, and it basically revealed that chess grandmasters play chess intuitively because they are able to see patterns on the board and recognize patterns. And that idea translates across. So the people who did that original research on pattern recognition in chess, that work's being extrapolated across to lots of other fields: firefighters, nurses, managers, doctors, you name it. And it's this ability that intuitive experts, and it is related to experience and expertise, this ability that intuitive experts have to recognize patterns and make sense of those patterns. So it's about pattern recognition. That's the holistic association thing in the definition of intuition. So for me, I'm a big fan of Darwin and evolution, and I think it evolved in us, our intuitive mind, sometimes called System One. It evolved in us as this amazing pattern recognition system, this ability for it to take in all of the cues, make sense of them, and come up with a response. However, and there's always a however with intuition, because
Absolutely. There's the other side. There's the one
yeah,
side and then the other side.
yeah, and well, and it's kind of a little bit of a classic thing of where a strength becomes a weakness, because it's
Right.
so good at pattern recognition. It often can sometimes, sorry, it sometimes can see patterns where none exist.
Yes. Hmm.
And it's this kind of confabulation thing that it's also capable of. So I just throw that in as almost, as a caveat whenever I talk about the strengths of intuition, which are undoubted. Um, the late Danny Kahneman talked about intuition as marvelous and flawed. And I think
Yeah.
that really sums it up really neatly. Danny Kahneman, of course, author of the bestseller Thinking Fast and Slow, the pioneer of what we call in psychology dual process theory, the two minds model. System one, the intuitive mind; system two, the rational analytical mind. And Danny Kahneman said the intuitive mind, system one, is marvelous, but it's also flawed at the same time. So we always have to keep that aspect of it in mind. So that was probably the longest answer I've ever given to the simplest question of what is intuition.
That's what happens when you have many years of expertise and experience, and trying to unpack this tricky topic, to make
Being
it
very clear.
really comprehensible. But of course, with my keen interest in metaphor, the metaphor that you use really works for me in terms of the analytical mind being a narrow broadband, broad band, and then the
Yeah,
intuition being the broadband, and
yeah,
seeing
yeah,
all
yeah.
these patterns. And
Mhm.
actually, Daniela's got a question I'm seeing in the chat. Can you give an example of seeing patterns where there are none? And I'm wondering out loud whether that links to some of the flaws of intuition. That was perhaps another question in the chat, which was, sometimes when we go with our gut instincts, we may have a very strong sense that we're right, even though, because we're seeing these patterns where none exist, even though we're actually not. So I think perhaps that moves us a little bit into the territory of, how can we understand some of the flaws of intuition.
Yeah. So I mean, a good example of seeing a pattern where none exists, I think, in social judgment is using a stereotype. So a stereotype is a pattern,
Right.
from and we can carry around in our heads mental models, stereotypes of what certain people are like,
Yeah.
and we can confuse those stereotypes or those patterns or those mental models with an accurate intuitive judgment of a person or a situation, but when it actually is not. I mean, the classic, there's no time to talk about the details of the research now, but the classic um, piece of research that Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky did many years ago that kicked a lot of this off, this whole heuristics and biases thing, was a thing called the Linda problem, in which they created
Yeah.
this stereotype of somebody called Linda. People can look it up if they wish to. It's everywhere on the internet. They created this stereotype of this person called Linda, and beguiled the participants in their experiments to make a wrong judgment about Linda based on the stereotype that the narrative that they created, Evelyn, had conjured up in their minds, and they use this as an example of the power of the stereotype to bias our judgments and ultimately to prejudice our judgment. So that's the downside, I think, of patterns and stereotypes. A stereotype is a kind of pattern in social judgment. But again, with intuition, where there's a downside, there's always an upside. So then, of course, if we say, okay, well, there's the Kahneman and Tversky work on heuristics and biases, which is kind of fed into the whole discussion of unconscious bias and prejudice. So there's no shadow of a doubt that intuition can, if it's used incorrectly and inappropriately, can lead to bias and prejudice and so on and so forth in social judgments, for example. However, where there's a disadvantage for intuition, there's always a flip side to it, and there's a huge body of work it goes under the umbrella of thin slice judgments. And there's this ability of humans to make accurate judgments of another person on something as short as a 6-second video clip. The experiments are there reported in the literature. I talk about it in the book. But although the intuitive mind is capable of bias and prejudice, it is also in social judgment situations capable of extremely accurate judgments. But again, the fine art, and I think it is a fine art, the fine art of intuitive intelligence is this ability to tread that fine line between the powers and the perils of intuition. And then, okay, so the obvious question then is, well, okay, tread the fine line. He's talking about the art of intuitive intelligence. What does that mean? What should I do? I think the starting point of becoming a practitioner of this fine art of intuitive intelligence is actually understanding the science behind intuition. There's plenty of it there now. There's decades of research there now. And I think once we begin to understand what it is and how it works, then we can begin to use it in an intelligent and an informed way. So again, to go back to, was it Daniela's question about patterns and stereotypes?
Yep.
Yeah, stereotypes have a downside, but also this ability to take in the whole of a situation in a social judgment and come to an accurate judgment of another person's intentions and motives is an upside of it as well.
Yeah. So when we're talking about intuition and we talk about it as a muscle to train, because I like the way that you differentiate between it not being magical or mystical, but it's actually more like a muscle that we can train. One of the things that you do in the book, which I think is really useful, is you talk about a 7-step process for how people can develop their intuitive intelligence in order to make better decisions. And so I think it might be helpful for us to talk a bit about those 7 steps, because that in the book, one of the things, again, I really love about the book is you talk very much about the science, because there's a lot of science going back for many years, over the last 100 years, on intuition. And you talk about some of the big thinkers who've really made academic footstones to really develop the thinking around intuition, but you also then give exercises for people to really build that muscle. So should we just talk maybe a bit about those 7 steps, how?
Yeah. So the book is, just to kind of foreground the book for a minute or two. The book has got 9 chapters. It's got an introductory chapter and a concluding chapter. The concluding chapter is about artificial intelligence and intuition's place in artificial intelligence. The first chapter is about what is intuition, blah, blah, blah. But then in between all of that, the bulk of the book is this 7-step process towards intuitive intelligence. So the first step is build your intuitive muscle power. The second step is get in touch with your gut feelings, notice them. The third step is know when and when not to trust your intuition. The fourth step is how to think without thinking. Now that sounds like a good idea, isn't it? We'd all love to be able to do that. How can you think without thinking? It is possible to think without thinking, and that's the fourth chapter. It talks about the whole science of intuition, insight, unconscious processing, etc.
Hang on, let me stop you just for a moment and ask another question.
Okay.
Intuition, insight, instinct. They're words that kind of all get jumbled together. Can you
They
talk
do.
about the three eyes? Let's talk about the three
Okay.
eyes. Intuition, insight,
We got as
instinct.
far okay, we got as far as step 4. I'll hold that in my working memory.
Okay, hold that in your working memory. Just talk about those and then we'll come back to step
Three
5,
eyes.
6, and 7. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. The 3 eyes. Yeah, one of the pieces of guidance I often give to people when I'm running classes on this with execs and master's students, MBA students, etc., is and it's one of the first things you really need to do in order to understand intuition is don't mix up your eyes. In other words, don't mix up
Don't mix up your
instinct
eyes.
and intuition because we'll find CEOs, a lot of them, Jack Welch and so on, writing about gut instinct in their
Right.
bios.
Trust your
Actually, when
gut.
you read
Yeah.
what they've written, they don't mean gut instinct, they mean their intuition. But for me, I like to just separate them out. So an instinct is something hardwired and biological, and it's not learnable. So like your knee-jerk reaction is kind of an instinctive reflex. The homing instinct in a pigeon isn't learnable, it's innate to the pigeon and whatever. And human beings we've got instincts that are kind of hardwired into us as well. Now, contrast that with intuition. So, intuition is learned, instincts are not learned. So, intuition is learned through experience,
Right.
feedback, coaching, etc., that's all to do with developing your intuitive muscle power. So intuition is learnable. It's a product of experience and expertise. So that's instinct and intuition to one side. And
Right.
then if we say intuition and insight, the simple distinction between those two is, well, the idea of insight, we're all familiar with the old story of Archimedes jumping out of the bath, crying out Eureka when he allegedly found the solution to the problem. And it's that, so the insight thing is that light bulb moment that we have when and here's the key word, that moment we have when we see, that's the key
Right.
word, see the solution to the
Insight. Yes,
problem. Insight,
mhm.
very good. Yeah, it's insight, literally insight. We see the solution to the problem. We can explain the solution to the problem that's been perplexing us. And it happens to us a lot of the time. It happens to me, but all the time, I have this perplexing problem. I can't crack it. It's a really tough nut to crack. I leave it to one side. I switch mental gears. I go for a walk. I go for a run. I go to the supermarket. I sleep on it. I wake up the next day, and we've all had it. That solution, it pops into your head like the click of the
Yeah.
fingers. That light bulb moment. That's insight, and that's seeing the solution to a problem. Now, the difference between insight and intuition is it's another S word, and the S word that carves out the distinction between them is that intuition does not see solutions to a problem; it senses solutions to a problem. This is why it's a judgment. So we sense that a situation, person, object might be right or wrong for us. We approach or avoid it. We don't know for sure. We cannot explain. So this idea that I just know, don't keep asking me. People saying the interviews, I just know that it's known without knowing how or why I know. I just know I have this sense. So to sum up the difference between insight and intuition, insight sees a solution to a problem. Intuition senses a solution to a problem. And what it does in the sense of sensing is it can give us a direction of travel.
Mm-hmm.
So in the case of and that can apply in lots of different instances. So for example, in the case of scientific discovery, and there are
Yep.
loads of examples of intuition in scientific discovery, where a scientist like Einstein or whoever will have a sense of direction of to pursue
Right.
path A rather than path B. And loads of examples of Nobel Prize winners who've talked about the guidance that their
Yes.
intuition has given them. The intuition doesn't give the solution to the problem. Often the solution to the problem will arise as a result of an insight after many, many years of hard work on the problem. But what the intuition can do is give you the sense of direction. It's almost like a GPS. It doesn't
Yep.
it doesn't give you the destination.
Right.
It gives you the direction in which to travel. So it's sensing versus seeing is the difference between intuition and insight.
Insight. Thank you. Thank you. And really helpful to for all of us on the webinar to remember, don't mix up your three I's, instinct, intuition, and instinct. And we had got to the fourth part of the 7 steps. So maybe we continue
yeah.
5, 6, and 7. You see, we remembered.
Three more to go. Yeah, well done us for remembering that. So yeah, the fourth step was think without thinking, which connects to insights, and we all like to be
Yeah.
able to think without thinking. Leave it to your unconscious mind to do the thinking.
Yeah.
Leave it to your unconscious mind to do the heavy lifting. Send the problem away. Leave it alone. Back off. Sleep on it. Come back to it tomorrow. And that, it can often work wonders. So that anyway, that takes us on to step 5. Step 5 is tune in and translate. Now, what do I mean by that? Remember, we were talking earlier, Heather, about intuition not being unable to tell us what it thinks in words. It tells us what it
Right.
thinks in feelings. So what we need a kind of a translation system where we can translate those gut feelings, those hunches, those vibes into something that's actionable. So the 5th chapter of the book, Tune In and Translate, offers a number of techniques where people can take those feelings and translate them into something actionable. So they can translate the feeling into, you like this. They can translate that feeling into a metaphor. And you've done
Absolutely.
fantastic work on metaphors, and I think metaphors are a really great way to articulate your intuition to somebody else. Because, of course, in family life, but in work life, we're not taking decisions in isolation. We have to take
No,
this in conjunction with other people, and we have to try to. If we feel of conviction about our gut feeling, we have to be able to convince them. We can't just ask them to trust our gut feelings because our gut feeling is not their gut feeling. Therefore,
absolutely.
we need a way to articulate it. And I think metaphors are a really great way to articulate it. And in the book, there's a table of metaphors that have proven useful over the years, like inner GPS, radar, you name it. There are all these metaphors that people can use to articulate their intuition. That's one way of tuning in and translating. The
Hang
other,
on, Eugene, can I just pause you for a
yeah,
moment?
yeah.
And perhaps we can ask people on the webinar to pop in the chat if they had a metaphor for intuition, what would
Oh,
it
good
be?
idea.
And we can
Yeah,
just see, what
yeah,
what what
yeah,
what metaphors do you have to
yeah,
describe your intuition? So that's an
yeah,
invitation for you to practice something that Eugene does talk about in the book. But and then perhaps you can continue. But let's see if there are some metaphors that come up from people
yeah. That'd
about
be
their
great.
intuition.
Let's elicit some metaphors. That would be fantastic.
Yeah.
People are,
So
people are endlessly imaginative in the way they articulate these things. So that's the metaphor thing for tuning in and translating. And then alongside that, alongside the verbal way of tuning in and translating, is a visual way, using visual imagery and guided imagery
yeah.
to articulate your intuition. Now, you mentioned earlier that again, just going back to the details of the book a little bit. So every chapter has got at the end of it what I've called workouts,
Right. Yes.
guided to
Hence the
building your
muscle metaphor.
yeah,
We're
the muscle
working out our
metaphor.
muscle.
Yeah, it goes through the whole book, this idea of the muscle metaphor. So, for example, at the end of chapter 5, which is this tune in and translate chapter, um, there are a number of workouts there that people can use themselves to help them to articulate their intuitions. But one of the other things about the book is, and one of the reasons I wrote it in the way that I wrote it, is that it could be used by a coach
Ah, okay.
or a mentor or by a trainer in a group situation. So the workouts in the book, again, you can use them kind of sort of like self-teach things,
Yep.
and they're
Yep.
very effectively there. But also, I think they could be used, and I've used them. They're tried and tested. They're the kinds of things that I've used with classes over the years, and I've captured them in the book. And they're nice exercises you can use in a group
Mm,
situation where you can get a group of people, management team, senior leadership team, whoever, you can get them to use these techniques, especially these elicitation techniques of
yep.
metaphor and visual
Yep.
imagery. You can get them talking about their intuitions. In other words, you can get them interpreting their intuitions, exchanging their intuitions, arguing about their intuitions, debating their intuitions, but at least coming to some common understanding about
Hmm.
this really hard to pin down, this ineffable, this very subjective thing that one of them is experiencing, that nobody else in the room can ever experience in the same way that they can. However, this idea of tuning in and translating is a way of articulating it so that it becomes interpretable by a group of people. And then that creates a platform for action to move forward. Because one of the worst things that I think that can happen with intuition, and a really good way to develop bad intuitions, is to put them away in the closet and lock them away and not share them with anybody else. Because what I find, and I don't know what it's like for other people, but all I can do is speak personally. When I do that, they don't go away.
No.
They're still there. But they kind of, I don't know, if you don't get them out in the open, they can fester, locked away in the closet. So I think one of the best ways to develop bad intuition is to put them away in the closet and not open them up to scrutiny by yourself, but also scrutiny of other people. And
Yeah,
that, that's
because
how,
you said that intuition is developed, and it's developed partly through us trusting our guts, through exercising the intuitions that we have by sharing them with other people, and that's a way that we can get feedback. And without that feedback, I think this goes, and we can't differentiate between the intuitions that work towards effective decisions and the intuitions that lead us metaphorically down the wrong path. And that was one of the questions I think we had quite a lot earlier in the chat, was how can we know when to trust our gut and when not to trust our gut? And one of the frames you bring into the book, which I'm sure people online will maybe be familiar with, is this idea of conscious competence or unconscious incompetence, and you talk a bit about that as a way of helping to understand when to trust your gut and when not to. Perhaps you could say a little bit more about that, because I think I found that a really helpful way of thinking, when should I trust my gut?
Yeah, I mean, an interesting point you raised in your run up to that question was this idea about learning, which I'll come back to if I remember. But the competence thing. So we go from this naive stage of unconscious incompetence. You're incompetent. You don't know you're incompetent. All the way through that ladder of competence through to unconscious competence. And unconscious competence is, for me, it's this kind of intuitive expert where
Absolutely.
your intuitive mind is a well-oiled machine. It's a finely tuned machine. It's seeing patterns. It's recognizing patterns. It's generating action scripts based on those patterns. It knows what to do in those situations. It's registering when things do stack up. It's registering when things don't stack up. And that's that almost that zone that people can get into at that unconscious competence level. Sometimes it's this kind of flow space where you're in it and you simply just know, and you're going forward in that kind of with that trajectory. But the point about going from this idea of novice to expert journey brings me back to the really interesting idea that you raised in your preamble to the question, and this idea about learning. Because if intuition is about building intuitive muscle power, then it must be about learning. And all of the things that you reeled off there about, say, having experience, getting feedback on the experience, getting a trusted colleague, getting a coach, getting a mentor to help you with the process. That's this whole journey of learning. So building intuitive expertise is a learning process. And I think for me, intuitive intelligence is not a destination.
No.
It's a journey.
So
I would never, I've been writing about intuition for 20 years now, written 4 books on it. I wouldn't dream of claiming to be intuitively intelligent. All I would say is that I am becoming intuitive.
You're becoming, in a process of becoming.
I'm always in the process of becoming, because it's not a thing, it's an ing. It's a process of becoming intuitively intelligent. And that's why, the whole thing about intuitive intelligence, it's almost like a lifetime's journey in a way. And it's a fascinating journey. And in doing so, I think what happens is you learn so much about yourself.
Yes.
So, for example, if I wound the clock back 30 years, I started out in industry. I was a young, kind of vibrant, energetic, hyper analytical, super rational manager in the gas industry. And I remember in one of my appraisals, my manager said to me, I might have shared this story with you before. He said, "You're not going to go very far in this organization unless you start trusting your gut a bit more," which was kind of a bit of a. It didn't register at the time, but
Of
what's
course
happened
not.
to me, what's happened to me over that intervening period is I've kind of begun to understand the limits of rationality. That rationality is bounded. Um, that rationality and analysis and data and analytics can only take you so far. And we need to bear that in mind in the current zeitgeist of AI and data and analytics and the
Absolutely.
trajectory we're on. It can only take you so far. And then there's something over and above that where human intuition can take you. So I'll overstate my case to make the point here. I think when data and analytics reach their zenith, then intuition takes over
Mm, mm.
and builds beyond that. But again, to come back to the point you raised in your question that you intimated that it's this thing about learning and it's a lifelong process.
Yeah, and I think that takes it out of the realm of the mystical and into our own hands, and that's what is one of the compelling arguments in this book is that it is something that if we understand the science and if we understand where it comes from and we understand the context in which it can be really useful, or the context in which it can be really dangerous, then we can learn to build and trust our gut. And now I've just seen quite a lot of comments are in the chat, so perhaps another little detour about gut. Trust your
Yeah.
gut.
Mm.
Why gut? There's a number of comments made in the chat about the role that the gut is the sum of experience and personality. Is there anything else you would add about trusting the gut?
Why trust your gut? Why the title for the book, I guess, as well. But one of the reasons for choosing the title for the book is because it resonates with people's experience. So
Mm,
I've done a lot of research on trying to get to the essence of the subjective experience of intuition, and
yeah.
I do a little exercise with people where I ask them to complete the statement, "When I intuit, I dot dot
Mm,
dot." So when I
mm,
intuit, I get a funny feeling that things don't stack up. And I've got hundreds, if not thousands, of responses to that. And it's been written up and published in journals, etc., etc. But if you analyze the responses that people give, and let's say if you produce a word cloud of the responses that people give,
yeah.
the word that's often at the middle of the word cloud and in the biggest letters, because as we know, in a word cloud, the size of the letters is
Right.
proportional to
Makes a
frequency.
difference.
Gut is always in the middle of the word cloud. And I think this is, it's whether people are literally experience a gut feeling, I'm not too sure. I think it's a useful metaphor. So for me, happy to say unequivocally and unashamedly. For me, my intuition is not in my gut.
Okay.
It's not literally a feeling down there in my viscera, so to speak. For
Right.
me, it's more above the shoulders. It's a hunch. This
It's a
almost sounds like an,
hunch. Hmm.
yeah, exactly. It's not,
Hmm.
this is going to sound a little bit like an oxymoron, but it's a cognitive feeling. It's something that doesn't quite, it's like
Yeah.
a Rubik's cube that won't, whatever, it just won't go back to, it won't line up. And
Yeah.
that's that hunch that this situation doesn't quite stack up. It's not quite, this doesn't work for me. On the other hand, it can be that feeling that the Rubik cube does line up and it all
Yeah.
fits together and you think, brilliant,
Yeah.
that's a green light for me to go ahead with this situation. So why gut? So yeah, so, I mean, to just say a few words about the gut thing. There's a whole body of literature about the enteric nervous system and all of that, and the gut-brain axis and the vagus nerve,
Absolutely.
all of those linkages, which there isn't time for us to go into. But I think if we think about gut as a metaphor for intuition, but we also accept the fact that intuition is embodied and it
Yep.
involves the body and it involves a physiological process.
Right.
Then we can actually, again, we're getting into the science of it and
Yes.
the whole body of research by a brilliant thinker in this area, Antonio Damasio, who wrote Descartes'
Absolutely. Yep.
Error. And he came up with this thing called the somatic marker hypothesis, where he talks about the way in which the body, literally the body, marks, soma, Greek for body, marks the somatic marker hypothesis, where the body literally marks decisions as positive or negative. So it's it's not simply a cognitive, psychological thing, it's a physiological embodied thing. What the nature of that embodiment is, I think, is a bigger question. And, when I first came to research intuition 20 years ago, in management at least, it was pretty much a greenfield site. There was hardly anything there. There was some earlier work that had been really, brilliant earlier work, but it kind of gone a bit fallow. And it was almost like a greenfield site. So I would say that in the past 20 years, intuition research has come on in leaps and bounds. However, 20 years is not a long time in science. So
No.
I think we're still in the early days. And one of the things that I think we really need to understand more about is the subjective experience of intuition. When someone says they've got a gut feeling, or someone says they've got a hunch, or somebody says, I've got a bad vibe or a good vibe, what do they mean? What does that mean? It's a fascinating question for me. What's it like inside the body of that person
Yeah.
when they experience this thing? So, and that's just one example of, lots of areas in which we need more research. So all I'm saying really is that we need more research on it. Within the early days of intuition research in business management, for sure.
Yeah. And of course, you draw together the research from Antonio Damasio about the somatic markers of experience, and of course you've talked earlier about intuition sensing decisions, and of course the body senses that with the mind.
Yeah,
So when you do your Rubik's cube, and sometimes it clicks, the cognition and the feeling work together.
yeah,
That's intuition, just as when it doesn't click. So yeah,
yeah.
it's
And
good to know.
interesting. You like this because you're interested in metaphor. Gut is one of the metaphors that comes up often in the word cloud, but another
Yeah,
word that often comes up is click.
click. Yeah, it just clicks.
Yeah, yeah. It does click, or it doesn't click.
Yeah.
And when something clicks, when it doesn't click, when a situation doesn't click, is just as important as a
Yeah.
situation that does click. Because if it doesn't click, that's telling you something about the situation. It's saying, hang on, there's something not quite right about that. This situation doesn't stack up. And that click is like an approach or an avoid signal.
Yeah.
So if the situation doesn't click, doesn't stack up, that's almost like a red light, say avoid, do not approach.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm getting conscious of the time. I mean, time is whizzing past with our conversation.
It is, yeah.
And I think we've talked about we've mentioned 6 of the 7 chapters in the book, and the final one is number 7. Hone your hunches. We've been talking about clicks and gut feelings and honing our hunches. And one of the things that I think is super about this particular book is the way that you highlight some of the original thinkers that you think have really contributed to this whole domain of knowledge. And I really want to ask you, who's your favorite big thinker in the book, that's really influenced you in the way you think about intuition? And
Yeah.
then, yeah, so let's just talk about that one first.
So one of the kind of features of the book, as well as the workouts that are at the end of each chapter that can be used individually or by coaches, mentors, trainers, one of the kind of in-text features of the book are these boxes every now and again where I pull out a big thinker. Because I think part of educating one's intuition is about understanding who these major figures are in the
Yeah.
history of scholarship of the subject. Um, and I'm prevaricating now because this is like being asked to choose between
Who's
your
your
children.
favorite child, or who's your
Which is
favorite
your
friend?
favorite? Which is your favorite child? Your favorite friend? All I will say is the name that comes up. Here's my political answer to this question. Not saying it's my favorite or anything like that, but the name that comes up invariably in management, at least when we talk about intuition, is Herbert Simon,
Herbert
who
Simon.
was professor at Carnegie Mellon for decades. He won the Nobel Prize in 1978, Nobel Prize in Economics for his work on decision theory. famous for the concept of bounded rationality. And what Simon did was he questioned, but it was very unfashionable to do so, the dominant economic, classical, rational model of decision making. And he said decision making isn't like the economics textbooks seem to be telling us that it is, because actually human beings can't be unboundedly rational. They can't be perfectly rational. He said that human beings' rationality is bounded, and he gave certain conditions for why it's and reasons why it's boundedly rational. But then what Simon also did was then he kind of segued into the idea of from bounded rationality, the limits of rationality, into thinking about how managers actually do take decisions. And of course, where he landed with that, or one of the areas where he landed with that, is the idea that's driven all of this scholarship ever since, that managers in the real world often take their decisions on the basis of their intuition. So then Simon did experiments, experiments on chess and pattern recognition and pattern matching and so on and so forth. But I think it was Simon who really kind of set the stage for it, built the really solid foundations. So it's for people like me, I'm kind of, humbled by being able to stand on the shoulders of somebody like Herbert Simon. And Herbert Simon said in one of his, milestone papers back in 1987, he talked about managers, and it kind of captures the whole thing for me in a way, as Simon often did. He talked about managers not having the luxury of being able to choose to use intuition or analysis. That's not available to you as a manager, because as a manager in the real world, what you have to do is you have to use both intuition and analysis. And what he's kind of then opening us up to there is this whole idea of paradox thinking and paradox mindset, which has become very fashionable and popular, rightly so, in management, where we don't think of either or. We don't think either intuition or analysis. We think of both intuition and analysis. So to become an effective manager, leader, senior leader, exec, we have to have command of both our intuitive intelligence and our analytical intelligence. And that then gives us this kind of roundedness, I suppose, to our cognitive economy.
Yeah, and that brings us back in a way full circle to where we started with the intuitive intelligence as what you're talking about in this book, complementing the rational intelligence and complementing the emotional intelligence.
Yeah. I feel it. But I have to say, in naming Simon, I do feel a bit guilty. And what I would say also is,
there's some comments in the chat about that, and yes, you're right, it is Herbert Simon. Well done, Daniela. And yes, why not Daniel Kahneman?
Well, I've read people's minds. I'm not looking at the chat actually. I don't know how to do it because I'm completely inept with Zoom. But the other person, of course, that we have to acknowledge and recognise is the late great Daniel Kahneman and the work that he did on heuristics and biases, dual process theory, system 1, system 2, culminating for many people in that kind of magnum opus of Thinking Fast and Slow 2011. So if I can have the luxury of naming two, can I?
Yeah, of course.
Thank you very much.
Let's be generous on this grey day with this fantastic conversation. Let's be generous and have your top two.
I'll name Herbert Simon and Daniel Kahneman. However,
now you're going to go down the list, aren't you?
But I would also say that this idea of intuitive intelligence is gaining traction. And the very eminent German psychologist Gerd Gigerenzer recently published a book called The Intelligence of Intuition, which I can heartily recommend. The Intelligence of Intuition, I think it was 2023, published by Cambridge University Press. So I'd urge people to have a look at Gigerenzer's fantastic work in this area as well.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. That's a good note to.
I got 3 in, didn't I?
Research. Yeah. My goodness. So we're coming towards the end of our time, sadly, together. There are so many comments and questions in the chat. I feel like we should do this on a regular basis, have a regular webinar together on intuition, because there's more
Intuition
questions, more
training.
comments than we can possibly field. So I'm sorry for not being able to field even more of your comments and questions. What I can say is that Eugene and I will be running a session at OWP in June on intuition. So if you are coming to IMD in June for OWP, you're in for a treat, because we're going to have a special topic session on intuition on June the 27th. So mark that in your diaries if you're coming to OWP. We will, of course, share the recording and a synopsis of this particular webinar with you. So please look out for that tomorrow. We'll share that with you, and we will look at the chat in following our conversation, and take any other questions to think about how we might have another webinar on this amazing topic. As we come towards the end of our time, Eugene, is there any words of wisdom you'd like to share with everybody on the chat, who's joining us on the webinar, about how to develop their intuitive intelligence?
How, well, I won't say read and buy and read the book, because that would not be an appropriate thing to say. No, I think for me, why it comes back to this idea of why is it becoming so important now? And one thing that we've not mentioned, we've talked about AI, artificial intelligence, but the other AI, of course, could be artificial intuition. So and there are some vendors out there who are claiming to have developed artificial intuition, and I don't know enough about artificial intelligence to be able to judge the validity of those claims. So the whole kind of area of, is artificial intuition ever likely to be a thing? I'm not competent to be able to comment on that, because I don't know enough about the field of artificial intelligence. But I know a little bit about human intuition. And my parting comment, I suppose, would be that human intuition is potentially a really important USP, source of competitive advantage for employees in the workplace of the future, but also for employers to develop the intuitive intelligence of your employees, maximizing the potential that they have to leverage intelligent intuition in taking decisions in their professional lives, in order to, build more successful, sustainable organizations.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you. I wholeheartedly agree with you that this is a very human skill, very much a USP, as you call it. And it's been a real pleasure having this conversation with you, Eugene. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your wisdom and your research, your experience, your expertise in this topic. And we've seen some marvelous metaphors on the chat about intuition as being eye-opening, and we want to say thank you to everybody for joining us. So with that, wish you all a wonderful day wherever you are in the world and whatever time it is for you. And thank you again, Eugene.
Thank you very much, Heather. Bye-bye.